The Romance. Some years previously there had been famine throughout the region. A man named Elimelech, together with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, had left their parched farm in Bethlehem and travelled east over the Jordan River in search of sustenance for themselves and grazing for their livestock. They settled in the land of the Moabites on the eastern shores of the Dead Sea. To make a bad situation worse, they hadn't been there long before Elimelech fell sick and died. Naomi was devastated, but life must go on, and as the 2 boys came of age, they met and married local girls, mixed marriages that might have been frowned upon had not Orpah and Ruth been so utterly charming. For 10 years all was well. Then sickness struck again. This time both young men succumbed. So there was Naomi, widowed, both her sons dead, and 2 daughters-in-law to care for. She resolved to head for home in Bethlehem, way up in the distant mountains on the far side of the lake. The 3 widows hadn't travelled very far before Naomi realized the folly of what they were doing. "This is madness. Why would you 2 pretty young things stick with me? I'm too old to even think about marrying again. And if I got married today, are you really going to hang around and wait for how many years, waiting for me to raise sons for you to marry? Go on back to your families and your friends. I am not safe company, since the Lord evidently has turned his back on me." They clung together in a pathetic huddle, hugging and weeping. Eventually Orpah gave in. "Well, okay, I'll go then, but I'll never forget you as long as I live." But Ruth refused to go. "There's no way I'm going to leave you," she sobbed. "I will go wherever you go. I will live wherever you live. Your people will become my people, and your God will be my God. I want to be buried where you are buried. May God strike me dead if I ever abandon you." Well, how could Naomi argue with that? So the 2 continued on their journey arm in arm. Footsore and weary, they arrived days later in Bethlehem, and they limped onto Elimelech's old farm. It was a tangle of weeds, and the house was a ruin. The neighbors noticed someone on the land. "Hey, what are you doing there? Wait a minute. Aren't you Naomi?" The years had not been kind to her. "Yes, but don't call me Naomi. Mara would be more appropriate. Better, since the Lord's made my life such a misery. I left with a husband and 2 sons, and now they're all dead, and look at me." Word of her return passed around Bethlehem. "She brought with her a foreign young woman, Moabitess. She was married to one of her sons. Can you imagine that? A foreigner." Nevertheless, there was a grudging respect for Ruth, who had stuck with her mother-in-law even through her own bereavement. Living off the land takes work, and their land had lain fallow for 12 years or more. There was nothing to live on. "Let me go to someone else's land and see if I can glean some of the grains that the harvesters miss," suggested Ruth. It was the beginning of the barley harvest, so off she went to the fields around Bethlehem. There were gangs of harvesters working shoulder to shoulder, cutting and standing the sheaves of barley. Ruth watched for a while, discerning who was the foreman. "Excuse me, sir, but might I be permitted to glean the grains of your harvesters, miss? I promise I won't get in the way." "Why, certainly, miss. You go right ahead." So all morning she crawled along, scratching among the stubble for the odd grain that might have been dropped. Around lunchtime, a very important-looking man, presumably the landowner, came to check up on the progress that they were making. "The Lord be with you," he said, and all the harvesters replied, "And with you too, sir," raising their caps. He went to have a chat with the foreman. Surveying the workers, his eye settled on Ruth. "And who's that, young lady?" he asked. "Well, that's Ruth, sir, a young Moabitess that came home with Naomi, the widow of Elimelech. She's a good worker by the looks of her. Never stops foraging for grain." Ruth saw the important-looking man walking towards her. Afraid that she'd be sent away, she pretended not to notice, going on feverishly scratching among the stubble. "Young lady," he said kindly, "you are most welcome to glean here on my field. In fact, don't even think of going elsewhere, for you'll be quite safe here with my servant girls, and I'll tell the men to leave you alone. Oh, and if you get thirsty, feel free to drink from those water jars over there." Ruth was flabbergasted. "Sir, I am amazed that you would even notice me, a mere foreigner. You are so kind." "Oh, no, it's you who are kind. I've heard all about how good you've been to your mother-in-law, leaving your homeland and coming to join a people that you know nothing about. May the Lord richly reward you, since you've come to place yourself under his protection." At lunchtime they all stopped work to eat what they'd brought with them. Ruth was a little embarrassed, since she alone had nothing to eat. "Come over here," someone shouted. She looked up to see the boss beckoning her. Nervously, she went and sat by him, as invited. To her amazement, he shared his lunch with her, more than she could eat, so she slipped some of it into her pouch to take home to Naomi. That afternoon it seemed the harvesters had become careless, for everywhere she went there were grains scattered all over the place, and amongst the standing sheaves there were whole heads of grain just lying on the ground for the taking. At knocking off time, she gathered up her gleanings and triumphantly poured them onto the kitchen table when she got home. "And that's not all," she said, pulling from her pouch the remains of the lunch. "Where did you get all that?" Naomi asked, aghast. "I think the owner of the field is a man named Boaz." Naomi's jaw dropped. "Well, there's a coincidence. That man's a relative, one of our kinsman redeemers, as a matter of fact." Since Ruth had no idea what a kinsman redeemer was, Naomi explained. "In our culture, the land is never offered on the open market. It has to stay in the family. So when someone dies, the closest relative has first option. But with it goes the obligation to raise sons to continue the family name and maintain the family inheritance. So the widow of the deceased also becomes his responsibility." "So Boaz has first dibs on this farm, and on you, Mama, Elimelech's widow?" "Well, yes and no. The land, yes. But since I'm old, there's no likelihood of my bearing any more sons to carry on the family name. But you, on the other hand—" Every day till the harvest was ended, Ruth would faithfully glean on Boaz's land, and every day she would pretend not to notice his glances in her direction. When the harvest was done, Boaz announced a celebration. "This could be important," Naomi told Ruth. "Have a good bath, and then put on your best clothes and wear some of this perfume that I've been keeping for just such an occasion as this. And then here's what you must do." That afternoon, all the workers joined in tossing the barley so the wind would carry away the chaff. And then as the sun was setting with a huge pile of clean grain in the middle of the area of stamped-down soil that served as a threshing floor, the feast began. Everyone ate and drank their fill. Ruth watched from a distance. She watched till the feasting ended and the workers started to wander off home. But her attention was on Boaz. The fire was burning low, and she saw him move to the far side of the pile of grain, and there he burrowed a bed in the grain and lay down to sleep. Soon his quiet breathing turned to rhythmic snores. Only then did she move closer, terrified that anyone would see her. She came right up to the sleeping form, curled up at his feet, and lay down, petrified. Perhaps it was a dream, or maybe it was the perfume, but at some point in the night something woke Boaz. He sat bolt upright, and there was a woman next to him. "Who's there?" "It's Ruth, sir. Let me share your blanket, since you are my kinsman redeemer." She held her breath. If Naomi had miscalculated, she, Ruth, would be thrown out in disgrace, a woman of loose morals. There was a chuckle from the darkness. "Well, bless your heart. All the young men in town have noticed you. You could have had your pick, but instead you come to me. Ah, kindness seems to be your middle name. Now, don't be nervous, but I must tell you that I'm not the first in line. There is a relative closer than I. First thing tomorrow I will go and see if he wants to redeem you. But if he doesn't, as sure as the Lord lives, I will marry you, and gladly. But lie here till morning." Just before dawn she got up to leave, before she could be recognized. "Hey, Ruth," he hissed, "don't go home to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Take this." He scooped a mound of grain into her shawl and helped her hoist it onto her back. Naomi was up early, but perhaps she'd never been to bed, so anxious was she to find out what was happening with her plan. Then in walked a radiant Ruth, who dumped a huge mound of grain on the floor. The answer was never in doubt. Early that morning, Boaz went and sat down in the town gate, an open area with the equivalent of a coffee shop. It was a place where the town council would meet, where business transactions would be sealed, where legal disputes were settled. Boaz sat for a while and chatted with the other elders who were passing the time of day. Then he spotted his man. Hey, excuse me," he shouted. "Would you spare a moment?" The man came over and sat down. "I need to bring to your attention the fact that the land belonging to the late Elimelech, our mutual relative, is to be sold, so needs to be redeemed. You are the closest relative, so it's yours if you want it. If not, I'll take it." The man brightened up at the news of this sudden windfall. "Well, yes, I'll certainly take it." Boaz's heart sank down to his boots. But you need also to be made aware that along with the field goes the responsibility for Elimelech's family. There's his widow, Naomi, to care for. And since both her sons are dead, you would have to marry Ruth, the Moabitess, Naomi's widowed daughter-in-law. He held his breath. "Well, that casts a different complexion on the deal. That might in the long term compromise my own family and their estate. So no, I won't do it. The land's yours, along with the woman." So saying, he removed his shoe and handed it to Boaz, a sign to all the surrounding witnesses that the agreement was final and binding. "So I want you all to witness my intention to purchase the land belonging to Naomi and also to marry Ruth so that the good name of Elimelech can be preserved in Bethlehem." The surrounding elders congratulated Boaz and agreed that they were indeed witnesses. They added a special blessing addressed to Ruth. "May this woman, who has come from afar, add to the family of Israel as did Leah and Rachel, wives brought from afar by Jacob. And through the children that this young woman will bear to you, may your family be blessed in the tradition of Perez, son of Judah and Tamar." And this part of the story really does have a happy ending, for within a year a child was born, whom they named Obed. Naomi loved and cared for that kid as though he was her own. Obed in turn married and sired a son named Jesse, who inherited the family farm in Bethlehem. There he raised 8 sons, the youngest of whom was a ruddy-cheeked little fellow named David.